So welcome everyone, and those who have signed up for the webinar this afternoon and those who are watching us live via Facebook. So as you all know, Future Leadership is a community of change makers who are being the change that we want to see in this world. And this platform is all about taking action and driving change. So we share tools and insights on how to take actions. We share insights into what we need to overcome in order to drive the change. And so it covers aspects of society, business, and leadership. In today's session on innovating for social impact, we are going to find out if there's a trend towards social innovations these days and what is driving the trend and what are these social innovations and what do we need in order to scale these innovations, what skills and resources does a social entrepreneur need. And also around next week, we will, as we do with all our other sessions, we'll upload this session as well, the summary of the session on our YouTube channel. And the link is in the description of the video. On our panel today, we have Geci with us. She's based in South Africa and she's a faculty at the Singularity University. And her focus is on urban futures, smart cities, networks, urban planning, governance, and development. And she's also an associate of the South African Cities Network. So we'll be able to get to find out what kind of innovations we have in the urban sector. And Shuan, he's worked with a number of organizations, including UN organizations, on their inclusive business initiatives. And he's conducted fieldworks in India, China, Myanmar, and Iran. So he's also a keynote speaker at TEDx UNESCO Innovation for Sustainable Development Goals Summit and the University of Tokyo. He has also delivered several lectures and training programs on pro innovation, inclusive business, and in emerging markets and social impact. And Fayaz Ahmad Sheikh, he's all the way from Kashmir. He is a postdoctoral innovation researcher at the School of Management in Hangzhou in China. And he has a PhD from the Center for Studies in Science Policy from Jawaharlal Nehru University in Delhi, India. And his major research interests includes non-formal grassroots innovation, informal economy, and the dynamics of secondary innovations. So welcome, panel, and thank you for coming here. So starting with social innovations, my first question to the panel would be like around early mid-2000, right? C.H. Prahalad, he had popularized the term bottom of the pyramid. A while back in India, there's Professor Anil Gupta, who had been working on grassroots innovation for decades. So, and then there came a type of innovation that we call pro-poor. As long as I've also known Shuan, he's been working on bottom of the pyramid and on innovations for SDG, and Fayaz and Geci on frugal innovations. And also for the first time I heard from Fayaz a type of innovations called secondary innovations. So first let's find out what these innovations are. Are these innovations different names with the same purpose? Are they serving society or solving some social problems? So can we start with Shuan?
The different words and phrases have been coined to describe the various types of innovations that are supposed to help underserved communities. To some extent, they are also something like a brand name. So if you are coming from a corporate world, initially the bottom of the pyramid was the fashionable word to use. Later, it was a bit criticized because of the negative connotation that bottom had. Like many people tended to think about those in absolute poverty as the only recipient of these innovations. So then it was later coined the base of the pyramid. Later on, other organizations like the UNDP came, then they used the term inclusive business, but it was more or less the same thing. So it was not so much emphasizing on the innovation side, but more on the inclusivity, because one of the criticism about the bottom of the pyramid was that it mainly sees the poor as potential consumers. So it talks about addressing their needs, but eventually they talk about providing a new product and service for them. But the starting point, and then pro innovation was coined by World Bank. So it depends which organization you come from, you would use a different term. That's a starting point, as Prahalad pointed out in his seminal book, The Fortune at the Bottom of the Pyramid, is the fact that about 2/3 of the world population are low income. And if we look at innovations and things that are being offered based on creativity, you seldom see innovations that have been specifically devised for addressing the needs of that 2/3 of the world population. And again, here I emphasize that the low income doesn't necessarily mean poor. This is a common misconception that happens. But the fact is that most of the private sector initiatives, those who have the potential to innovate, they mainly look at the needs of the 1/3 of the top income earners in the world.
I think for me, over time, what the distinction has become is social who it is for, or is social who is doing it, or is social how it's being done. And I think all of these might matter, but I think that might be part of the distinction between some of these terms, because I do think that the end that speaks more to inclusive and participatory innovation tends to be about process, tends to be about how the innovation itself is undertaken and developed, and that needs to be inclusive. And if I can just use a personal story in that regard, I work in the space of cities, and often there are two kinds of things people tend to be interested in. The one stream is the kind of smart city, high tech, end of things, and that's very popular, and often that's what people want me to speak about. The other end of it tends to be where there's a really active interest in the informal innovation, so what's happening with the informal sectors, what some people have grown to call the hustle economy, and what's coming out of there. I remember at one stage raising that, look, if you want me to talk about the smart cities end of innovation, and then people use terms like, how we can innovate for the billions. My question often is, well, what will the billions be doing while the few of you are innovating for them? And so I think for me, the question of who is doing the social innovation is so important. And those who have need innovate a heck of a lot every day.
I think the winter, which Professor Muzakato mentioned a couple of years back, that winter is arriving with the existing innovation models. I think the winter has arrived now. And that's why we are seeing the formal structures are crumbling. People are struggling. Millions are going out of jobs. And probably it's one reason is the existing, the previous models of innovation and growth had not actually taken care of all these things. COVID and the current situation in which we're living right now offers us that window of opportunity where we can actually look at the previous innovation models and then, pick up from those models and then look at how we can basically create hybrid innovation models where social element is highly and hugely embedded. If we put people at the center, profit, if we actually give it a backseat, I think it's also offering a great opportunity whereby we can create these new social innovation models where social benefit is basically at the center of the paradigm, and profit basically is shared by all actors. The actors who invest in innovation exercise and the people who take advantage or dividends of that whole exercise.
Fayaz, so the example of work on frugal innovations, right? So you had recently organized a COVID-19 Open Innovation Challenge. So you say that's a perfect plan of what a frugal innovation is and how learning is incorporated into it.
It's titled as "It's time for Europe to think frugal," because I've also realized that the existing or the previous innovation models are probably not sufficient to deal with the new challenges which are emerging with COVID-19. When I was in Kashmir, I could see everybody was complaining that, health system is not updated, doctors are struggling, patients are struggling. And even yesterday, there was a report that for almost 5,000 COVID patients who are admitted to different hospitals in Srinagar and Kashmir, there are only 47 to 50 ventilators available for 5,000 COVID patients. So when I was in Srinagar, I realized that, this is actually a good time. We look for frugal innovations, we look for local solutions, we look for these grassroots solutions and see if we could actually get something whereby we would be able to help our doctors, engineers, and people, who are basically fighting from the forefront. And then we went on with this Open Innovation Challenge. It was a group of 3 entrepreneurs. I conceptualized the idea, but it was quickly picked up by local entrepreneurs. So we kept around 100,000 Indian rupees as cash prize for the best innovations. And it was just like a try to see how people will actually, they collaborate with this whole innovation exercise and what kind of solutions we would get from the people. Since I have been doing my research on this grassroots innovation and informal innovation in the last couple of years, I think it's almost a decade, I have been scouting these informal innovations from different parts of India. And I know that there are better solutions, they lie with the people. So I was actually looking for that creativity, that how can we tap that creativity and how that creativity could be channelized and used for the people good. And to our surprise, we got almost 160 prototypes and very good ideas about fast oxygen machines, we call them ventilators, for PPEs, for masks, and how to distribute food to red zone. And now we have reached a stage where almost 1 ventilator is under simulation with the top health hospital of Kashmir. Our doctors are actually taking different trials of the same machine, and I'm sure within a week or 2 we will be able to. We are thinking of donating almost 10 to 20 ventilators to different hospitals of Srinagar. So the solutions right now are coming from the people. So if you make people part of this whole innovation exercise, I'm sure they have the best solutions with them. But it's up to the policymakers in the state how actually they build on this people's knowledge.
So what are the typical limitations to scale these innovations and so that they can make a bigger impact? Is it money, is it time, or is it resources or skills?
One of the typical myths that is associated with innovation is that the perception that innovation is about a product, like it's a service, or even worse, or which is the most common view, is about the technology. All these things are needed, they are part of the innovation process, but often they are considered as the end result. Most often, especially for social innovations, once you have a prototype or a product or service ready that seems to be working and seems to be addressing a problem, that's just half of the journey. We have countless examples of good innovations that there are lots of good intentions behind them. The prototype seems to be working, but eventually they fail, they don't take off for various reasons, but the top reason is that they don't manage to get diffused target audience or target beneficiaries, or even if they are distributed and diffused, they are not accepted. And this is one of the misconceptions, that if there is a need and we provide a solution for that need, people will be more than happy to take it and to use it. It's helpful to make a distinction between need and want. One of the things I worked on was sanitation, especially in rural parts of India, where there is a need for proper sanitation system. And actually there are government projects and international projects that they do build toilets. But what happens in many rural areas, that after 6 months, when you revisit those areas, you see that the toilets are abandoned. The need for proper sanitation is still there, but the demand for the system is not there yet. And actually the big challenge of social innovations in most cases is how to create this demand. Why this is the case? Because in many government projects or development projects, still they calculate or they evaluate the success of the project based on the product's distribution. So once the toilet is installed, they tick the list and they go to the next village. They don't wait to see if people are really using it. And this is another challenge of social innovations. You cannot prove the results immediately. This is where the social part of innovation shows its importance. And we have to understand the society. What are the beliefs? What are the belief system? How people in that specific society make decisions.
And even if we've got something that ought to meet a need or a want in a particular society, there are other dynamics at play. There are commercial interests at play, there are politics at play, there are all sorts of things. So I think acknowledging that there's a particular economic regime and political regime within which these things happen becomes so important. Fail, whereas if one looked at it from that perspective, it would be obvious. And in that sense, what I mean is, I work, for example, with a civic tech innovation network. So this is a different kind of I guess, space of social innovation. It's activists who are doing really interesting, cutting edge stuff. And with many of them, first logic of commercialization and scaling is, or IP protection in the kind of conventional sense, it's almost the opposite, if you want, of the logic within which they work. Now, obviously, what can happen and what has happened in our context, partly because of that, is then the exploitation in some cases where people will participate, whether it's in hackathons or whatever, maybe get paid out and given a glass of wine and some sandwiches. And then next thing, there's a really huge deal and a German provider who provides that as a nationwide service. And these are real stories. These things have happened. And that's problematic. But I think more problematic is maybe not to recognize that we are in a time where I think there are different economic logics and models at play and that are competing. I think Fayaz was talking about the fact that some things are changing. But in that process of change and of these systems coexisting, I think it also becomes quite tricky for people who are innovating in different ways and for different purposes. And sometimes that really does get in the way. For us in the civic tech space, we're looking to places like Taiwan, where we think there are interesting models, and in part through a government that then plays a very different kind of role in terms of understanding their relationship to the innovation space versus the market, not versus, and the market.
Problem, I guess, is multidimensional, but there are other, invisible factors and visible factors which actually probably led to the scale down of these innovations. And in most cases, it's political. In some cases, it's economical. There are interest groups which won't encourage, social innovations take a lead over the market-led innovations. And I have seen many cases in India where I could see, there are different interest groups which try to discourage attempts toward social innovations.
So what kind of types of organizations right now, maybe non-governmental, that are helping scaling up these social innovations? Can you all give an example of this collaboration that's being successful?
One weakness of the private sector in bringing social innovation, despite the fact that they have the technological know-how, there is a kind of a psychological distance between, in the private sector, like typically engineers, and the society, the community that is supposed to have the solution. And that's maybe one other reason why we see more solutions coming from India, where this distance is less, because anyone can go to rural areas. It's not that difficult and see what's going on in the country. But we don't see many successful cases of social innovation coming from the West, because that psychological distance is too huge. And that's actually one of the reasons why this whole movement of bottom of the pyramid also did not provide any significant result. Still, there are good cases coming up from countries like India because of this, the fact that the psychological distance is less. And the NGOs can help to close this gap because they have a better understanding on the community side. They have the trust of the community. This trust is something that private sector often doesn't have. And another advantage of the non-governmental sector is that the professional ones, they know how to speak the language of the people, of the society, of the community. And in a study that we did on the sanitation in rural India, we found that actually the successful ones were those who take the hand of the community, they stay with the community, and they do what's called troubleshooting. They stay with them until they found out what are the potential problems that can happen.
So I'll pick up two cases from India and China. One is innovation for social cause, and the other could be innovation driven by a social cause. For example, in India, we have many organizations where some top doctors, they have created some innovation models where social cause becomes important. For example, you have heard about Dr. Shetty's that heart hospital where heart surgery is done with a very, that's a very low cost solution for people struggling with cardiac issues. And then we have Jaipur Food. That's again a very frugal innovation which is being celebrated, and the cases are being cited by World Bank and UNO, and there are many cases of emulating that in different parts of the world. But there are other cases where innovation is driven by social needs. For example, you have grassroots innovations where people feel that they are in search of a particular thing which will actually create solution which markets have failed to offer them. There are different organizations like in India. Honeybee Network, which is run by Professor Anil Gupta at Indian Institute of Management, Ahmedabad. They have documented and scouted almost 200,000, more than 200,000 innovations from almost 500 villages of India. Basically documenting innovations done by common men from rural areas. They're not doctors, they're not from formal sector, they're not innovations done by firms. They're basically innovations done by common men where they struggle with basic needs, basic unities of life, and then they thought of innovating.
To find a solution, yeah.
Find a solution locally, using local resources and whatever was available in the rural areas. And then we have innovation for social goal, where firms R&D is required, and then you come up with an innovation solution where you want to serve people at large. So, in India, that National Innovation Foundation, Honeybee Network, it was an NGO. It started in 1980s with Professor Anil Gupta as its founder, and then they started documenting them, profiling these innovators. And ultimately, they started connecting these local innovations to formal research and development organizations. For example, if you have an engineering technological innovation, you will get consultancy from institutions of India. And if you have something, a herbal solution, so they will directly guide you to the ICMR or some top doctors and other health departments of India, so that, they could scale up together and they will blend formal and informal knowledge structures. But, out of 200,000 innovations, I still see a scale up is a problem. That mass diffusing for these gross innovation is still, I couldn't see that mass diffusion of these innovations, like, where one innovation from one community is copied and used in different community. While as in China, Shuan, I was reading his profile, he has worked in China at Tsinghua. We have this popular case of Taobao and Pinduoduo. It started with Alibaba, and then it was just a commercial website where people would come and they would sell stuff and buy stuff. It was just a very, formal innovation, which was actually done using secondary innovations, which I'll talk later. But then government thought of, adding the social dimensions to that model because it was working and it was connecting people from rural areas. And then they did that resource mapping and capability mapping, and they could identify, people where you have the resources, where you have the capabilities, and then state started working with Taobao, and then they started building infrastructure, they started offering incentives, and they helped both the people as well as Alibaba and Taobao. And now we have almost, it started with 3 villages in Hangzhou, in Shenzhen. Now it has almost more than 4,000 to 5,000 Taobao villages are coming up in China. And the transformation is astounding. So I think the role of the state is very important, and mapping of resources and capabilities and building right incentives is something which is very, very important. And
all of us, and I'm also trying to do the same thing, is to think about scaling and impact in particular ways. And I wonder whether those concepts are also changing. I don't know whether scaling means the same thing in every case. We've been looking at case studies around Africa, actually with an intent of finding the scaling, because we are looking at where innovation is really having economic level impact, big societal impact. So we're looking for those Alibabas, and we're looking for those M-Pesas, and we're looking for these gigantic impacts and uptakes. And I wonder whether that's the only thing that's important, or whether that's not really coming again, speaking of economic models and rationalities, whether that's also not something that's potentially not quite as fixed as we've always thought. Will these innovations only matter when they become multinational corporations? Do they not matter when one community is using them effectively, and if the next one wants to, they can, but they may do something different, and that's okay.
All these solutions that we are talking about, whether it's grassroots or via collaboration of different entities, eventually they need to create an impact. And actually one of the other myths that we have with innovation or social innovation is that the impact will be there if you just diffuse the innovation. I think there is a big difference between commercial innovations, like the commercial approaches to innovation, and what we need for a social innovation. In commercial innovations, like an ordinary entrepreneur identifies a need in the market, then he or she develops a solution, provides resources, bring together different actors, and eventually the market either accepts or it doesn't. But when the diffusion happens in the market and people start to buy or companies start to buy it, then it's considered as a success. In social innovations, this is only half of the story, because after that, so you have to make sure that the user is using it properly, or the user is aware how this can be beneficial, under what conditions it can be beneficial, and they have to accompany the target users the whole way until the impact is realized. And like the literature on innovation doesn't offer much insight, because the lion's share of the literature on innovation is based on commercial innovations, where the diffusion in the market is end of the story.
I do think for me what's clear is three things. And in a way, these are the 3 points that I hoped to make on this panel. The one is that we need imaginations that appreciate context. So I'm very keen on a localization. And yes, I agree, obviously there has to be some diffusion, commercialization understood broadly, people have to have livelihoods and that sort of thing. And there's got to be a reason why people invest time in these solutions. I believe in that. But I do think that we have imaginaries that are locked into things that I think are abstract and are not perhaps real in the contexts where people are. And I think that's something that limits, first of all, innovation itself. Because if I'm solving not for the problems I have, but for the things that I think are sellable, then, you can plan, play second or whatever. My second one would be about processes. These ideas that inclusion, co-production, co-design, I really don't believe anymore in this idea that R&D happens somewhere separate from the context where things play out. And I also really get very concerned about what I call innovation prospecting, the idea that some clever person can go to where poor people are doing things and then figure out how to make this innovation work. And the last one is the institutions. So that's where I'm beginning to talk about the economic models that we imagine. It's very difficult to have old rules, old systems, old measures, and try and force feed everything into that same sausage machine. And I think because our literature and our knowledge is constrained, we tend to do that. So we tend to think about formalizing informality. We tend to think about how our existing institutions and rule books can just be tweaked to fit in things that look nothing like what we were dealing with before.
Are Indians more innovative, or is it because of the numbers, because there's already a lot of demand in markets, as opposed to maybe South Africa or other countries in Africa, right?
So if you look at the geographical locus of those innovations, certain regions in India, definitely they are more entrepreneurial. I think this is the same with any other country. Like certain regions are more entrepreneurial, they just try things out. In India, I think the fact that also like English is widely spoken, so, and also there is a wide Indian community in other countries, so this international networks have also shaped and lots of so, and innovation is result of networking and contacts with different people. So innovation, that's maybe one reason why in China we don't see many successful social innovations. There are, but it's tends to be a closer system compared to India. Also, they're linked to their cousins in the US or Europe or somewhere else, and these links actually lead to more innovation.
I come from India, and when I look at the impact side of these innovations, where upliftment and development at the margins, if you take that as an indicator, then I see more progress in China happening compared to India.
Because I think the government is more involved in the process.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. And the way they try to learn and absorb the capacity of of Chinese, I think is more higher and
and the institutions are more absorptive
and then
as
we have this
opposed to
made by Professor Hippel. He cited and the cases by innovations by man in Europe, and he had a huge list of innovators. I think the list is 5 times more than the number of innovations we have in India. So it's basically which innovation we're looking at and which side we're actually looking at and which part of innovation we're dealing with. So I think that's very, very.
So there's one question also related to what Shuan mentioned about the psychological distance. He says, Shuan mentioned that because of the closeness in India, there are more innovations, whereas in the West, because of the longer distances, there are not so many. So I would like to ask that as an engineer living in Canada, who is interested in social innovation and entrepreneurship, how can we learn and contribute more in such causes and projects?
Now, thanks to Zoom and all this social media, it's easier to share and exchange ideas. And some global networks are taking place, like these Engineers Without Borders, MBA Without Borders. There are like platforms where people can go and contribute.
Form networks and collaborations.
Right. So, and for me, what was the eye-opener? So for a couple of years, I went in Maastricht, like just reading books and papers, but it didn't help me much. So the real thing was when I went to rural areas and to see for myself. So my recommendations for anyone, regardless of geographical location, is just to, you have to roll up the sleeves and get your hands dirty.
One interesting thing which also happened with COVID-19, I call it the brighter side of the pandemic, was the democratization of the top, elite innovation models. Now we have many, these innovation collaborative attempts coming up around the world where people from different nationalities, from different backgrounds are collaborating and co-creating new solutions. For example, we have MIT Frugal Vent.
One last question is from Sia Bulela. She asks, what academic qualifications and processes are required to add value and have an impact on these social innovation drives?
I would think any. I'm not even sure you need any. But I just think that there are people coming from almost any field. I mean, I mentioned that I'm in the civic tech space. I mean, there are people from no degrees to English degrees to computer science degrees of the highest order. So I think any
dropout. Great.
In fact, South Africa, there's a big program in Africa called Harambe that's exactly looking at dropouts and in fact the idea that they can actually do really proficient technical work in spite of not being able to qualify in terms of national exams and that sort of thing. So I think it's less about the qualification, more about the aptitude, the interest, the passion.
Those who are interested just to learn, there are also very good online courses, and many of them are freely available. In Coursera, there are a number of courses on social entrepreneurship. For those who are from a technological background, MIT Courseware also offers some interesting and free courses on technology and innovation for society.
So we learned a lot about social innovations. Who is it for? What is it for? How is it done? Old structures need to break, new opportunities, and obviously social innovations need localization, the right incentives, and also some people mentioned, the panelists here, about the role of government. And we also spoke about the psychological distance, and Geci said that we need new imaginaries, the local context, the localizations and processes that are more inclusive. And we also need to think of our institutions. Thanks for being here. See you soon.